3 for the minutes to record, and hand over to Rick Stewart, who's going to do a welcome to country.
I think pretty much everybody knows me here. I'm Rick Stewart. I'm a director on the board, and I'd just like to pause for a few minutes and for a very important and appropriate thing. So let's begin. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Gadigal people of the Eora tribe, along with elders, both past and present. They are the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today. And also upon their traditional lands sits our very own head office for Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. So may I also pay respect to the knowledge that is forever sealed within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Rick. My name's Christine Tink. I'm the Vice President on the board at SCIA. Unfortunately, Joan, our President, Joan Hume, wasn't able to make it today, and she sends her apologies. With me I have Peter Perry, the CEO of Spinal Cord Injuries Australia, and Jodie Burling, the Company Secretary. If there are any other apologies that anybody has apart from Joan? No? We have 2 guest speakers this afternoon, but unfortunately they're running a little bit late, so we might just move on with other business. President's report. Since Joan hasn't been able to be here this afternoon, the report is in the annual report that has copy can be obtained up at the entrance. So you can read that there. And financial statements.
Thanks, Christine. So I'm going to provide a brief report on the financial performance for the last financial year. A copy of the financial statements have been provided at the front desk, have been sent to all members, and there's also a brief financial summary in the glossy annual report. Last year wasn't the best year financially for the organisation. We operated at a deficit. Unfortunately, that was the second year in a row that happened, and pretty much the reasons are much the same. We're finding that our fundraising revenue is not meeting our expectations in the last couple of years, and what we've traditionally done as an organisation, we don't get nearly enough money from the government to fund our operations. So we operate our commercial operations through our Australian Disability Enterprise, our exercise services, which are fee-paying services, and we also do fundraising to provide additional resources to meet the needs of our members. So when any of those other revenue sources fall short, then we find it harder to operate at a surplus. The first year, last year, looked like a blip, but 2 years in a row looks like more of a pattern. So what we've done for the next financial year, the one we're currently in, is we've been more conservative about our fundraising expectations, and I'm pleased to report that year to date for the first 4 months of the year we've met our fundraising targets, so that's good. We've also reduced our expenditure as much as we possibly can without impacting on the services we provide to our members. So more our administrative and other type expenses we've tried to reduce. However, having said that, we're at an interesting stage of the organisation where we're transitioning from the old world of a government-funded charity to the new world of an NDIS-funded social enterprise. We're right in the middle of that transition now, and so what we're trying to do is build a new organisation for the future world while still meeting the needs of our ongoing funding contracts, which run until 2018. So we're almost running two organisations at once, an old organisation and a new organisation. And some of our staff members here today know very well the difficulties that that brings, because we're trying to stay in the old world and continue into and build the organisation for the new world. So it might be tricky for a couple of years. The good thing is we've built up a very strong base of reserves over the last number of years. So I look back over the last 10 years and the total operating results for the organisation is a surplus of $2 million. And that's basically surpluses adding up to $3.5 million and deficits adding up to $1.5 million. So in the last 10 years, we've actually added to our reserves, but we obviously can't continue running at a deficit for many more years. So the measures that I mentioned before in terms of more conservative forecasting of fundraising and reducing our expenditure is meant to address that. So next year, at next year's AGM, I'll be able to report on the success of that. So I'm happy to take any questions now from anybody that has any.
I haven't seen the financial statements yet, but what's the difference between the operating loss last year and the operating or and the operating loss this year?
It's about 300,000 increase. It's around 700,000, so it's quite significant.
And what happens to the organisation if it continues to operate on those lines?
Well, if we make a deficit of 700,000 every year, we won't have any money in about 5 years' time. But that won't happen.
You said the first 4 months of this year is sort of on target in terms of revenue.
Yep.
What is the budget for the end of the year? Is it projected loss or?
No, we always budget for a small surplus. So I think the budget for next year is a surplus of about $60,000. We always budget for just a small surplus, and most years we achieve that.
Are there any other questions that anybody would like to put to Peter or our auditor? No?
Does the auditor have any concern?
Scott covered from PK.
I was not given a clean audit report, so obviously it shows that we have no concerns.
And the next thing that we have to do on the agenda, since our guest speakers have still not arrived, would be the election of the directors. If I could pass over to Jodie Burling to carry on further.
Okay, so I'm just going to read out the report that Corp Vote have provided for us. And so they declared that the following persons have been elected to the 3 positions as board directors in order of votes received. First is Brett Stevenson, second is Mark Macaulay, and third is Bradley O'Hara. So congratulations to those 3 directors. I'd also like to thank the other nominees for their interest and effort in applying to be a director on the board. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank David Braun, who's been serving on the SCIA board for a number of years. So thank you, David, for all your time and great work for the organisation.
Thank you, Jodie, and welcome to the board. And yes, thank you, David, for it's been lovely seeing you. I hope we'll still see you around. Yes, Duncan Wallace and Bryce Bissell from Project Edge have just arrived. So if they're organised and had a breather, perhaps they don't need a breather. Welcome this afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. Anywhere you like.
Very distracting view for an AGM. Willie? Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting us here today. Myself, Professor Bryce Bissell, is the Professor of Neuroscience and Regenerative Medicine at UTS, and the Director of the new Centre, which is currently in its last few issues of being set up. But I'll let him elaborate on that a little while later. I'm CEO of Spinal Cure. We share offices down at William Street with your colleagues in the marketing department of SCIA. And we always say that you're the care, we're the cure. We're exclusively focused on research to find a cure for this unpleasant condition. I don't need to tell anybody here what difference a spinal cord injury can make to people's lives. I really don't need to go into the details of that as I would when I'm talking to a corporate or government agency. At some point in the discussion, you've got to make them feel really unpleasant so that you can bring them out the other side with the news that I'd like to share with you today. Now, a lot of you will know something about Project Edge already, I'm sure, from the publicity that's been going on. But very briefly, I'll give you a little background. We first became aware of the work of Professor Reggie Edgerton. Actually, well, I met Bryce. I'll step back a little further. Back at David Prast's funeral, David was a director of both organisations. And it was his wake, rather than his funeral, I guess, at Bondi there. And I was new to the organisation at that stage, but one of the things that had sparked my interest in coming on board was a paper published in The Lancet about, with just one subject. And Professor Reggie Edgerton had managed to get, with this epidural electrical stimulation, had managed to get this one person from a relatively complete quadriplegic to moving his legs, to being able to stand on his own 2 feet, not walking, but certainly standing, and with other improvements. Now, the first 4 people, another 3 people with this same operation with the little electrical stimulator implanted on their spine. The first 4 people were followed through to another paper in 2014. All 4 of them can now stand, but more than this, they have return of the other things, those things on the SCI iceberg that are hidden below the surface: the bladder and bowel control, the sexual function, the temperature, core temperature control. These are the things that are coming back, and they're coming back not only when the stimulator is on, exciting the spinal cord, but when it's turned off, they're remaining. And this is the very exciting thing to us, because it means that the nerves in the spinal cord and the pathways from the brain to these autonomic functions are strengthening or regenerating. Professor Edgerton has since gone on to develop a way of doing this without the operation, using external electrodes, what he calls transcutaneous, painless electrical stimulation. It's not enough. It's an important point to note here that electrical stimulation is not activating the muscles of the legs, or not and not causing these functions to happening. It's simply waking up the spinal cord to put it in a state where it can hear messages that are trying to sneak through a contusion injury. Any injury, most of the injuries we see in Australia are, the result of the squishing of the spinal cord. But not all the nerves are dead. The brain is finding pathways, jumping sideways, finding another nerve, getting down a little bit lower, it seems, and getting messages through. But they're not coming through strong enough for the pathways in the spinal cord and the functions of the spinal cord to be able to act on them. Whereas this stimulation is bringing that excitability, the threshold, if you like, up enough that these are being acted on. So we got very excited about this, and Bryce and I have been talking about it for a long while, and Bryce has a much bigger vision, and which we now share. He's been across to see Reggie Edgerton, the chap in UCLA in California, and we're very proud that Reggie has now is coming to join us in Project Edge at UTS. He will spend maybe 30% of his time here as an adjunct professor there, working with Bryce. We have embarked on a $10 million fundraising camp, well, so now up to 12 million. Bryce is saying 14, so, it keeps going up. Yes, take your vote on that. I'm pleased to say that we are some way into that already, having some funding success. And, well, you have been a great part of that with SCIA coming on board to co-fund a fellowship in the name of David Prass for somebody to lead this with and work with Professor Edgerton. The idea being we've got a 5-year program. We want to extend the work that Reggie has started with the transcutaneous stimulation and develop that. One of the key goals will be to develop a product that could be commercialized initially, because it's the way we can get it to the most people. And within that 5-year project, hopefully have some initial product that can start getting rolled out. We think maybe through the Neuromove centers as being the best way to do it initially, before you can get one that would be suitable for home use. But that's the big goal. Now, the first experiments that we're excited about, Reggie has recently shown that you can return hand function to quadriplegics using this stimulation, which is the number one thing people want back. So that, to me, I mean, I've been 32 years in the chair. I don't know if it's too long for me, but if Reggie wanted to have another guinea pig, I'd put my hand up like a shot for that one. But for anybody, and there will be somebody else who hurts themselves today, they are not necessarily looking at life as they are when they come out of hospital. And that's particularly exciting. And I'm going to hand over to Bryce and let him detail the wider vision that we have at UTS and the centre that he's putting together, because that, to me, also is equally as exciting as the current project.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's beautiful out there today. So first I want to thank Peter. Peter Perry is an extraordinary person. You're very lucky to have him as your CEO. And I feel that very strongly, actually. I feel that strongly about Peter, and I feel that strongly about Duncan and his organisation. As a scientist, I long ago promised Joanna Knott, Duncan's chairperson of Spinal Cure Australia, his boss, that I would make a serious effort to try and solve spinal cord injury. And yeah, I guess we're on that journey now. But what's been really phenomenal is to have this situation where, as a scientist, I can focus on the best possible way to bring about recovery for people with spinal cord injury, to really focus on finding the world leaders anywhere in the world, try to bring them to University of Technology Sydney to participate in that single mission, instead of this usual approach in science, which is not to blame the scientists, but the way science often works, where people work in silos and often can't get quite out of those silos to create the transformative changes that we need. But the only reason I can even dream of that is because it's a partnership between the group that I lead with a very visionary CEO that you have and another visionary CEO here. And what is remarkable whenever we have, and believe it or not, we have our issues when we're not between us, but actually at UTS and trying to set things up. When you're trying to do something transformative, it's often having to be explaining to people why it's transformative and explaining that we're trying to do something a bit different here. And that can be occasionally challenging. So what we are doing is differently. It's a different model. We're saying we're going to work with the funders who have an interest in the actual outcomes, and we're going to deliver outcomes. And this is a novel way of doing science, it turns out. But you've got partners you're working with, like Peter, who says very little, but what he says is very crisp and clear. And he says, I'm here for one reason, and that is my members. And I am committed to making sure that those members get the outcomes that they deserve and need. And that's what he says. He keeps it very, very simple and very clear, and his actions support those statements. So it's not just words, it's his actions. And he can only do that because of all of you here and because of the board that in turn makes sure that Peter's here to do his job. So I think you should be very glad that you've got such a sincere and committed CEO. As I said, the same is true of Spinal Cure Australia. And the other thing that is remarkable for me as a scientist who's been, I do cross into other areas besides spinal cord injury. And the fields of science can be quite competitive. Competition is not always a bad thing. Competition makes people, keeps them on their toes. However, it can get a bit out of control when you've got relatively few resources and you find those resources are being split down too many pathways in the name of competition. And what you find is that this does happen in other fields of endeavour, but in the spinal cord community that I have been, I'd say, fortunate to deal with, except that it's not fortunate to have a spinal cord injury. But as a human being who's impressed by people who try to make a difference in this world, it's very exciting to work with organisations like Spinal Cure and SCIA who are able to work together in this collaborative way. And it's even more than collaborative. I mean, they share the vision, they work together, they've got their own areas that they're particularly interested in. But when it comes to pushing this initiative into place, they're extraordinarily respectful of each other in terms of what each other's concerns are and worries are and issues are. And at the same time, they're absolutely committed to work together to make this new initiative work. So I think you should be very, very grateful to these organisations. In terms of what we're trying to do at UTS, I was recruited there I was at the Garvan, but prior to that I'd spent a very formative 10 years in the United States working at the place called the Salk Institute. At the time that was ranked #1 in neuroscience. And it was ranked #1 in neuroscience by objective measures that we have in science, and it was ranked far ahead of the Harvards and many, many other top places around the world. And I worked in the laboratory of the guy who was actually the one who mainly contributed to that major ranking. And that's because of the extraordinary work he did. And this guy was very humble and very similarly committed to science, but also social justice, the sense that science should be applied to things that make a difference. But also that environment was all about innovation and possibility and creativity, and to foster and to celebrate that and to celebrate working together. And the Salk Institute itself was actually set up as this beautiful building. In some ways it actually may not look beautiful, but what's beautiful about it was designed by Louis Kahn to be a building that fostered people working together. So the building was set up so that when you walk down a corridor, you're likely to run into other people. The labs were created in such a way that you had to walk through the labs and you had to run into people. There were lots of common and open spaces, and it was designed to be set up to be efficient for science and also for ensuring maximum chances of people working together. And it was through working together across different laboratories that we ended up with some very nice discoveries at Salk, and it was one of the reasons it was #1 by a long way ahead. I came back to Garvan in Australia. I was very fortunate to meet Joanna Knott, who and become very close to her through what at the time was Crystal Reeve visiting out here in Australia, and I was part of that whole event. And became, over 10 years, I was on the advisory board to Spinal Cure Australia and became very aware of the real issues of spinal cord injury. And to be honest with you, you guys with spinal cord injury in the audience here, you're not your best marketers of yourselves in the sense of sharing with people what spinal cord injury actually is. It's taken me as a scientist a good 10 to 12 years of being with Joe and Duncan and friends of theirs to actually get a true, well, the best picture you can get, I don't know what the true picture is, the best picture you can get of what it is to live with a spinal cord injury. And of course, the realities of that are things that aren't particularly pleasant to talk about in public, but in fact, if you don't talk about these things, people don't actually understand what the realities of this condition are. And as I've got to understand the condition, I feel increasingly passionate about the mission of transforming people's lives with this condition. So how do you do that? As a scientist, I'm very proud of the research I do, but I'm just one person. And one of the things that I can do as a scientist of caliber and who's been living in the United States for 10 years and who's back here now is to say, look, you know, I can't do it on my own. The same way I've got to have the community group to make it possible, because they're the ones who are going to make it viable, feasible, and actually our partners. I mean, the way we do everything, we talk about everything that we're going through all the time. And not only are they true partners in the sense of the building of the initiative, but the other partners you want to bring in are look around the world and say, well, who are the various people in spinal cord injury who you would look to and say, look, if I had the perfect dream team of scientists working on spinal cord injury, who would they be? You look around the world and there's probably a good 5 or 6 people, remarkably, relatively few, who are really the dream team. And then there's some people who you'd want with the dream team. And so the vision that I have developed after having been at the SALC and knowing what the excellence that the United States craves for and the excellence that it demands is to try and capture these individuals, bring them into being part of what we're doing, and as much as possible involve them in the process of working together to create outcomes. Now, Reggie Edgerton was really the first person that I approached, and I approached him. It was one of those wonderful stories of life. You know, Joe, I said to her years ago I was going to try and make sure that I do everything I could to help with spinal cord injury. So I said, Joe, I'd read the paper in the Lancet. I said, Joe, this is it. I'm going to get you over to meet this guy and we're going to get you fixed. Of course, it's a bit naive because he hasn't fixed anyone, but he's certainly made dramatic improvements. So I got Joe, went over to speak with Reggie Edgerton. He looks at me like I'm from Mars, which I probably was, and we realised it's not going to be realistic to get Joanna not over there to get her final injury fixed or anyone else. So then I decide, okay, well, that's not going to work. So if you can't bring Joanna and people with injury to UCLA, you bring UCLA to Australia. So I went back many times, and Reggie recounts this, and he says, Bryce just kept turning up in my office, and I did. I just kept turning up in his office and saying, we need you in Australia. We'd like you to help us establish what you're doing over there. And I said, one of my promises to him was that we'll replicate it faithfully. We're not going to try and sort of modify it or change it. We'll try and replicate what you've done faithfully. And in science, that's actually very important. It's very important in science to replicate what other people do, independently, not just because it's good for Edgerton to have someone else doing the work in Australia and rolling out his discoveries, which are unbelievably remarkable. I mean, the first time in human history we've had voluntary movement back to people with spinal cord injury. It's magical. It's crazy stuff. To watch the videos and to see the data, it's crazy stuff, right? And to get him out here to do it, it's fantastic for him to be able to roll out what he's developed over many years. But it's also important scientifically to replicate what someone else has done, to demonstrate that it actually is something that can be replicated and is robust. And so that's part of what we'll be doing, and then subsequently developing it from there to become the next generation. That's what we're going to be doing at UTS, to try and take his technology and go to the next generation. And it evolved that he eventually ended up seeing the extraordinary commitment of people like Peter's group and your group, and of Spinal Cure and myself. And then he saw that at UTS there's the engineering department and a health department and science, and that we all want to work together. And that the Vice Chancellor was saying he wants to be involved in this. I mean, that's a big deal. The head of the university says this is important. And he said, you know, this has got the potential to really take what we're doing to the next phase. So he essentially agreed to work with us to help create a centre here that does his work and that we will hope to be able to roll out for the community here who have got the injuries. But in addition to that, as I said, I think that we want to take a holistic approach to spinal cord injury, and I don't know that, you know, we've got to be very careful. Edgerton's work is not allowing people to get up and walk again. What he's getting is voluntary movement back. They're getting voluntary standing, which is amazing. That doesn't mean locking the legs and assisted standing. They're able to balance and stand. Huh? Oh, okay. So, but I think we're going to need other technologies, and those other technologies are stem cells. We're going to need bionics. We're going to need approaches to deal with acute injuries still. We need to develop those. And, sorry? Yeah, material science. There's a whole bunch of areas that we need to develop. And the idea there is that at UTS I'll get this neuromodulation program up and running, and then subsequently we'll start to introduce the stem cells and we'll introduce the other areas, but in the same way we'll bring the world leaders into Australia to work with us. And we've already spoken to someone called Michael Fellings. I don't know if you've heard of him. Michael has expressed interest in being part of our centre. There's another guy from Harvard who's agreed to be part of the centre. So we're going to create this extraordinary effort together. So on that note, that's kind of where we're at. If you've got any questions, I think I'll leave it with whoever wants to ask the questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Now's the time. No?
What you say the cure of those partially cured so they were recent breaks?
No.
One of them was 7 years down the track when the break happened. So we really don't know how far that can go at this stage. Yeah.
I mean, one of the other parts of what we're trying to do and why SCI are involved for a lot of reasons, but one of the components of our program is going to be a strong exercise component based on the NeuroMoves model, and we're talking about having a research component to that as well. But what's important for sure is that the exercise element, keeping yourself as fit as possible through the things that NeuroMoves do, if that is done, certainly it looks like you can have a chronic injury, and as Duncan said, 7 to 10 years after the event. In the case of the first, Rob Summers, the first person, he'd had it for a solid year, and he'd had intensive exercise, and it was the neuromodulation that gave him the chance and the step up. So it is in fact not useful in a acute injury, and in acute injury there's other things that we would probably try and do. It's once the injury is established, we know where the person's health and fitness is, we've had them through an exercise program for a year or so, that they can then go into the neuromodulation program.
It's actually a lot more than that now, but...
Yeah, I was going to say you must have a long queue of people wanting to do
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue, and I think that you've just, you know, the thing that's frustrating and is the urgency and the fact that, you know, we've got to get, it's an expensive program. I mean, actually in international terms, it's not that expensive. We're talking about $12 to $14 million over 5 years. And if you look at what salaries are and how that all works, it's a lot of money in Australian dollars terms, but in what we're used to, but it's actually not a lot. But we have got to get it, and we have got to move. We have got to get this thing up and running because it's critically urgent that we make this available, not only for Australia, but Southeast Asia is kind of the vision we have. There's so many emails every single day. And in fact, if you're interested, you probably should be, we haven't quite got the list ready yet, but we should be making sure that people are registering their interest.
We have an email at edge@spinalcure.org.au at the moment, or if any email going to Project Edge, just to register interest at the moment, and then you'll be notified as soon as we've got a register online where will be all the questions that the scientists need answered. And then when they're ready to actually request volunteers, they'll send out to those people who fit from the answers to the questions.
Anyway, so he's done about, I think it's almost 50 people now, isn't it? It's coming towards, yeah.
Bryce, can you share with the audience your key milestones? If we're standing here in 12 months' time, what sort of things would you be hoping to achieve
Yeah, money's a big factor. That's a complete determinant. Yeah. Without money, we can't do it. And we've got to have the team, we've got to have the space, we've got to have the equipment. But the nice thing is that the space has been allocated by UTS now, and they're putting in $1.5 million to make that space viable and ready. The idea is that, assuming a building goes to plan, which buildings sometimes go to plan, but often they don't, we should have the space by July. It may end up being a bit longer than that. As soon as the space is up, Edgerton has said that and we've agreed that, again, subject to the funds being available, about $200,000, will bring his team out, and his team will actually do the first set of experiments on 3 to 5 people and work to try and bring back by the end of 2017, if we got the space in July, evidence that he's able to bring some hand function back to people with quadriplegia. And then
within the next calendar year.
Within the next calendar year. That's the milestone at the end of 2017, subject to the space and money. Right. And then after 2017, we start to take that, we repeat that again, but with our own team. And once we've got our own team trained up in how to do this, then we start to go into the innovation phase where we start trying to get the technology better, because Edgerton himself says that he hopes within 5 years that he uses the word expects, so it's a brave thing to say as a scientist, that at the moment we can get standing function in paraplegics, and together with all those other things that we've spoken about, body temperature control and regulation, bladder, bowel, sexual function, and etc. Back. But he believes that there's a good possibility of getting quadriplegics, providing quadriplegics the possibility to walk with assistance as in a walker across complicated terrain. So that's what he wants to try and achieve within 5 years. But in terms of hand function, the same idea is to try and take it as far as possible. A lot of this development is not only about technology development, but also scientific and programming development. And the important part of what his work is that you do work in humans and you take it to animals and then straight back to humans. But it's all focused on human outcomes. Anyway, I probably answered a bit long, but hopefully I answered your question.
Bryce, what would the differences in regards to treatment for a complete quadriplegic as opposed to?
Yeah, I mean, so I can't. That's why you bring out Professor Edgerton. I can understand what he does and I can make sure it's on track, but it's not my job to do his work. I mean, he would have to answer that question. I do believe, from what I know of his work, is that the methodology is essentially the same. But if you're an incomplete, he believes it's going to be easier to get your function back than if you're a complete. The important part of his work is to say what we thought was complete is probably not a correct definition anymore. That's one of the major things. I mean, some scientists were saying, well, all you're doing is showing that people didn't really have a complete injury. And he says, what I am doing is showing that people didn't really have a complete injury. And that in itself is a remarkable finding. And so he's redefining complete and incomplete. But what different protocols are used, I can't answer that.
Yeah, I mean, you would think with a complete injury there are more pathways still active in the spinal cord, so it might work better. He also thinks it might work better with children because they're still developing, but that's some way down the track. The other really exciting thing that we perhaps ought to mention, not completely relevant here, but early unpublished results are suggesting that this might be effective for cerebral palsy and stroke, which, that really broadens the range as far as successful commercialization of a product and getting it out to a wide range of people.
Any other questions? So I just conclude by, again, congratulating Peter and the board. It's remarkably innovative what we're trying to do, and this organisation, you should be very proud. You should be all giving yourself a set of claps for the work you're doing to make this a possibility. And that's what I would leave it on.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody here, Duncan and Bryce, for not only coming along today, but also for the job that you do or for the work that you do. It's very exciting. Challenging. Next. Where are we up to? Appointment of auditors. Peter.
So, as I mentioned before, Scott Tobert from PKF is here, and just for the record, PKF have agreed to act as auditors for the coming financial year, unless Scott disagrees with that. No, good.
Thank you. Special business, as probably, I don't know whether you're aware, but we have been working with a new company constitution. The board would like to ask everybody to consider, and if thought fit, pass the following resolution as a special resolution. That for the purpose of section 136(2) of the Corporations Act 2001, and for all other purposes, the company adopt the provisions of the Constitution tabled at the meeting and signed for the purposes of indication by the chairperson as the Constitution of the company in substitution for the present Constitution of the company, which is repealed. So, a show of hands. Oh, has anybody got any comments or questions? Anything that they're unsure of in the new version of the Constitution? No? Well, we'd like to put that to a vote. Can I see a show of hands who is for the new Constitution? Gosh. And I'm a yes. And anyone against the new proposed Constitution? That's fantastic, that makes that easy. I declare that carried. Next, we'd like to propose 2 new life members and vote on that. The board suggests or recommends that Elizabeth Boutet and Michael Magro be elected as life members of SCIA. All those 4. And any against? I declare that carried. 2. Is there any other business that anybody would like to raise? Then I think we can declare the meeting closed at 3:52. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.